The echoes of Gerrard's words reverberated through the chamber, settling like a heavy fog. The Deathworlders had long since stopped considering themselves the protectors of others, the arbitrators of peace in a universe that had grown too accustomed to their goodwill. The idea that kindness could heal all wounds had once seemed noble, but over the centuries, it had become a burden, one that crushed their spirit, wore down their strength, and turned their warriors into mere symbols, pacified by the relentless demands of others. It wasn't that they had lost their compassion. They had simply come to realize that the universe was not ready for it. They had offered peace, and in return, they had been taken for granted. They had been betrayed, ignored, and manipulated. And worst of all, they had been underestimated. For too long, the Deathworlders had tried to coexist with those who could not understand their nature. They had been patient, diplomatic, even self-sacrificial. They had shared their knowledge, their technology, their resources. They had fought for the weak and protected the helpless. But with each act of kindness, their reputation diminished. The galaxy no longer feared them. Instead, they were seen as an inconvenience, a resource to be exploited, a tool to be used when it suited others. And then, one fateful day, everything had changed. It wasn't a battle, not at first. It was a decision, a quiet, deliberate turning point in their history, one that had rippled out in waves. The Deathworlders stopped holding back. They stopped being nice. Gerrard had been the catalyst. As the leader of the council, he had seen firsthand the erosion of respect for their people. But it wasn't just the petty political squabbles or the underhanded tactics of their so-called allies that had driven him to this point. It was something deeper, a fundamental shift in the balance of the galaxy. The Deathworlders had been bred in the harshest conditions, forged in the fires of their violent, unforgiving world. They had faced death, famine, and disaster, and yet they had survived. But in the eyes of the universe, survival was no longer enough. Strength was no longer enough. The universe had come to expect their protection, their sacrifice, without so much as a whisper of gratitude. No more, Gerrard had said in the council chamber that day, the weight of his voice thundering through the room. We have been nice long enough. It's time for the universe to understand the consequences of forgetting who we are. And so, the plan had been set into motion. The Deathworlders would remind the galaxy of their true nature, not through overt violence, but through a show of force so subtle, so calculated, that every species would understand. They would return to their roots, to the primal strength that had once made them feared. The galaxy would remember what it was like to face true power, and the peace they had long taken for granted would unravel. But Gerrard knew that the first step was the hardest. There were those among the council who still believed in diplomacy, in compromise. They were not convinced that this path was necessary, that it was worth the risk. But as Gerrard looked around the room, he saw the resolve in their eyes. Every one of them knew that there was no other choice. The time for kindness had passed. We must make our first move, Gerrard said, his voice gaining strength with every word. We will demonstrate that we will not tolerate any more disrespect. And we will do it in a way that leaves no room for doubt. The plan was simple, but its execution would send shockwaves through the galaxy. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was a reminder. The Deathworlders would no longer be pushed around. They would no longer allow the weak to exploit their kindness. Their strength, their ferocity, would be their language now, and it would speak loudly. Across the galaxy, there were whispers, first in the corners of space stations, then in the chambers of galactic councils. It began as a rumor. The Deathworlders are changing. They are no longer the peaceful protectors we once knew. They're something else now. In the halls of the Tethra Republic, an alien diplomat stood, his trembling hands clutching the datapad. A report had just come through, one that spoke of the Deathworlders' newly established blockade around the Xeron trade lanes. It wasn't aggressive, not in the traditional sense. There was no firing of weapons, no bombs or bombs. Just the sheer, unyielding presence of the Deathworlders' ships, their engines purring like a predator waiting for its prey. The blockade was a message, one that spoke of power and control, and the unnerving quiet before a storm. At the same time, a fleet of Deathworlder ships descended upon the ancient peaceful world of Vertamine. Its leaders had long relied on the Deathworlders' protection, but they had grown complacent. The leaders had expected the usual gestures, negotiations, promises of help. Instead, the Deathworlders simply landed, and without a word, began to dismantle the centuries-old alliance that had once bound them. They showed no interest in talking, no interest in pleading. They were simply taking back what was theirs. And so it began. The shift was small at first, but soon it spread like wildfire across the universe. Other species, who had once dared to challenge the Deathworlders, began to feel the chill of their return to strength. Slowly, the reputation of the Deathworlders began to shift. They were no longer viewed as the protectors. They were now the untouchable, the unstoppable. It was said that when the first planet fell silent, every species on the edge of the galaxy paused. They remembered what it was like to fear the Deathworlders, to acknowledge their power. They remembered the old stories, passed down through the generations, stories of a time when the Deathworlders had ruled the galaxy with a silent ferocity. And now, with the decision made, the galaxy would have to come to terms with the truth. Every species still tells stories about the day the Deathworlders decided to stop being nice. The galaxy had always danced to the rhythm of its own balance. Order and chaos, peace and war, the weak and the strong. For centuries, the Deathworlders had been a part of that dance, the sturdy pillar upon which others leaned. But now their place in the galaxy was shifting. The wheel was turning, and the universe was watching as the Deathworlders stepped away from the dance, casting a long shadow over all who had once taken their presence for granted. On the planet of Orseal, a hub of commerce and culture located at the crossroads of major trade routes, the tension was palpable. It had always been a neutral zone, a place where every species could find common ground, negotiate deals, and exchange ideas. The marketplace bustled with traders, diplomats, and travelers from every corner of the galaxy. There was no conflict, no fear, just the hum of an ever-moving society. Until the Deathworlders arrived. No one had known they were coming. Not a single ship, not a whisper. One moment, the skies were clear, the sun shining down on the city of Gassan, and the next, the shadows of Deathworlder warships blotted out the light. Massive ships, sleek, silent, and ominous, dropped out of hyperspace like specters, their hulls gleaming like polished obsidian. They didn't announce themselves, nor did they ask for permission. They simply arrived. The first response from the Orseal Defense Fleet was predictable, diplomatic, polite, and entirely ineffective. They sent out a small contingent of ships to greet the incoming fleet, their commanders likely hoping to resolve the situation peacefully. After all, Orseal had always been a haven for negotiations. The Deathworlders had been their allies once, but the Deathworlders didn't waste time with pleasantries. Their ships didn't even raise shields. They simply loomed, dark and patient, in the atmosphere. A single message broadcast to every ship in the system, a message that crackled through the comms with cold, precise clarity. This is your final warning. For an hour, there was nothing but the silence of the universe. The Orseal fleet waited, unsure of what to do, their sensors pinging uselessly against the indomitable presence of the Deathworlder ships. The galaxy had long relied on their kind for guidance, but now it was unclear whether they were being tested or threatened. The clock was ticking, and then, without warning, the Deathworlders fired. The blasts were not aimed at the defense ships, but at the artificial moons that orbited Orseal. In a show of raw power, they obliterated one of the moons with a single well-placed shot. It didn't explode. There was no dramatic burst of fire or debris. The moon simply vanished into nothingness, a sudden and absolute removal from existence. It was as though the universe had decided that the moon had never been there at all. The message was clear. The galaxy had always thought the Deathworlders' reputation was an old tale, a story told by the elders, a myth passed down through generations. But this was reality. This was the moment the Deathworlders reminded everyone of who they were. The world would never be the same again. Across the galaxy, governments scrambled to react. News traveled quickly. and soon the entire sector knew that Orseal had been rendered an example. The question that reverberated in every council and boardroom was simple. What would the Deathworlders do next? Gerrard stood at the front of the council chamber, the weight of every eye in the galaxy upon him. He had known it would come to this. He had always known. His decision had been methodical. But even now, with the power he had unleashed, there was a gnawing feeling at the back of his mind. The Deathworlders had no interest in conquest, not really. But they had made one thing clear. They would no longer be seen as passive observers in the galactic theater. "We've made our point," Gerrard said, his voice as composed as it had been when they first made the decision. "Let the universe see this for what it is, a warning. Those who think themselves strong enough to challenge us will learn the truth. We are not to be trifled with." The council members around him nodded. Some were eager, even hungry for more. Others, quieter, perhaps fearful, still harbored doubts. But the tides of change had already begun to wash over them. Gerrard's message would echo through the stars, and there was no retreating from it now. A holoscreen flickered to life in front of him, displaying a live transmission from the Orseal system. The destruction of the moon was broadcast in vivid detail, its impact sending ripples through the fabric of the planet's atmosphere. The once thriving marketplace now lay in eerie silence, the city streets empty, the people of Orseal staring up at the Deathworlders' ships, frozen in fear. "We've done more than just show strength," Gerrard continued. "We've stripped them of their certainty. We've shown them that we are no longer their guardians, nor their allies. We are the apex predators, and we will no longer let them believe they can control us." "Not just them," a voice interrupted from across the table. Lyra, the head of military strategy, stood with her arms folded, eyes narrowed. "This is about the entire galaxy, isn't it? The entire universe must know that if they push us, we'll remind them why we were feared in the first place." "Exactly," Gerrard replied. "There is no middle ground now. We are either respected, or we are feared. And fear, as history has taught us, is often the more effective of the two." The room fell into a contemplative silence, each member of the council lost in their thoughts. The decision had been made. The Deathworlders were no longer peacekeepers. They were predators in a galaxy of prey, and the universe would soon learn that mercy was no longer a currency they were willing to trade. On the other side of the galaxy, in the distant reaches of the Zareth Void, a quiet war council was being held among the Vrel, a species of cunning and manipulative traitors. They had long been allies of the Deathworlders, but the destruction of Orseal's moon had shaken them to their core. To them, the Deathworlders' subtle shift was the final declaration of a new era. They would have to adapt or perish. "Have you heard what they did?" one of the Vrel commanders asked, his voice low and cautious. "What the Deathworlders did to Orseal. They didn't just destroy a moon. They changed the rules. No one is safe now." Another commander, older and wiser, nodded grimly. "They made their move. Now we make ours. We either prepare for their wrath, or we seek a way to end this before it becomes worse than we can manage." In every corner of the galaxy, the ripples of Gerrard's decision were felt. The first move had been made, and the Deathworlders were not turning back. The universe would remember the day they decided to stop being nice, an event so far-reaching, so complete, that its consequences were still unknown. But everyone knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy would now live under the shadow of the Deathworlders, and that shadow would stretch far and wide. The months following the destruction of Orseal's moon rippled out like a stone cast into a vast lake. The immediate aftermath had been chaos. Diplomatic talks were held, but nothing was ever resolved. The Deathworlders had shown their power, and now the universe held its breath, unsure of what to expect next. But even the most cunning species in the galaxy knew that fear could only last so long before the urge to act began to stir. Every faction, every empire, and every trade consortium that had once looked to the Deathworlders as a bulwark against the chaos of the galaxy now found themselves standing at the precipice. The scales of power had tipped, and the universe was scrambling to regain its balance. On the lush, jungle-clad world of Gizar, a planet once known for its wealth of bioengineered flora. A meeting of great importance was taking place. The Gerrard, a species of biomimicry experts, had always thrived by playing the long game, manipulating events from the shadows. Their alliance with the Deathworlders had been a profitable one, but their position had always been tenuous. Now, with the Deathworlders' shift to a more brutal stance, the Gerrard had to decide where their loyalty truly lay. Rook, the head of the Gerrard Council, sat at the head of a large, glass-topped table, his 6 eyes narrowing as he examined the live feed that flickered in front of him. The images were of Orseal, once a thriving symbol of galactic cooperation, now a dying husk of its former self. The wreckage of the moon still lingered in the orbit, its fragmented pieces creating a permanent scar on the planet's sky. "Are we certain of this?" Rook's voice was low, calculated. He could sense the tension in the room, his people's unease apparent even without needing to read their pheromone signals. The Gerrard were a pragmatic species, focused on survival through diplomacy and subterfuge. The Deathworlders, however, had made diplomacy irrelevant. "If we act against them now, we risk everything we've built." The Council murmured in agreement. They had made a fortune off the Deathworlders' protection, and now their very existence was at risk. But Rook was no fool. The Gerrard were nothing if not adaptable, and adaptability meant knowing when to fight and when to flee. "We must adapt," Rook continued. "The Deathworlders are not simply shifting their strategy, they are rewriting the rules of engagement. If we are to survive, we must find a way to placate them or outsmart them." A voice from the far side of the room broke the silence, its tone sharp. "And what do we do if they don't let us? What do we do if they see us as their next target? They've shown they have no interest in maintaining their previous relationships. If they wanted us gone, we wouldn't even see them coming." Rook's mandibles clicked in thought. The Vrel had already made their first move. Ambassadors had been dispatched to every major power, seeking alliances, trying to gauge the mood of the galaxy. The fear was palpable. There were murmurs of war, whispers of rebellion in some corners, and rumors of old enemies banding together to form an opposition. But Rook knew that all this panic could either work in the Deathworlders' favor or it could turn the tide. "We will have to do both," he said finally. "Make our peace, but prepare for the worst. If we are not part of their future, we will be part of their past." The council fell into an uneasy silence, each member weighing Rook's words. No one wanted to be the first to stand against the Deathworlders. Their power was undeniable. But as the days passed and the galaxy seemed to shift more sharply in their direction, the question lingered. How long could they remain in the shadows before they had to choose a side? Meanwhile, on the moon of Danska, a once untouchable military world known for its formidable defense capabilities, the mood was entirely different. The warlords of the planet had long respected the Deathworlders, not for their diplomacy or kindness, but for their sheer ferocity. But even the warlords now sensed the winds of change. Grak, a burly Danskan warlord, paced in his dark, heavily fortified war room, his hands clasped behind his back. His scarred face was hard as stone, his eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of him. It was a map of the galaxy, dotted with countless systems, each representing a potential target. Grak's people had survived through conflict, their entire society built on a foundation of strength and violence. And in a galaxy where strength was becoming scarce, it was only natural that they'd seek to test themselves against the Deathworlders. "Are we truly going to let them walk all over us?" Grak's voice was a growl. His second-in-command, a younger, wiry Danskan named Shira, stood across the room, watching him with calculating eyes. "You know the Deathworlders. They don't just conquer. They make us question whether we even want to fight," Shira replied. "We've never had to face an enemy like them before. Our strength is legendary, but they've shown that theirs is beyond anything we can imagine." Grak's lips curled into a snarl. "Then we will make them imagine us. They've shown their power. We'll show them ours." Shira's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't provoke them if I were you, Grak. The way they're moving, they've already made it clear. They don't care about old alliances or old enemies. They'll strike first, and they won't wait for us to catch up." Grak paused, considering her words. Shira had a point. There was something different about the Deathworlders now. Something more dangerous. They were playing by their own rules, not the galaxy's. The fear they had instilled in the galaxy was not just in their power, but in the absolute certainty that they would not back down. But Grak's blood boiled at the thought of bowing to anyone. We will test their resolve. We'll hit them where it hurts, right at the edge of their borders. Let them know that we are not afraid. Shira shook her head, but she knew better than to argue. The warlords of Danska were not the type to cower. Grak had already sent a fleet to the fringes of Deathworlder territory, positioning their ships near the systems that bordered the Deathworlders' newest expansion. They had made their move. Now, they would see how the Deathworlders would respond. Back on the Deathworlder capital, Gerrard stood before the council once again. The battle for dominance in the galaxy was now a matter of course. His forces were ready, and his fleets were positioned to respond to any challenge, whether from old allies or new enemies. The Deathworlders had shown the galaxy that mercy was no longer an option, that their strength would be the new language of diplomacy. They had already made their first mark in the universe, and they would make more if necessary. His gaze swept over the council members. There was no turning back now. We will show them what happens when they challenge us, Gerrard said, his voice calm but filled with the quiet authority of a predator preparing for a kill. The Deathworlders no longer bow. We will stand tall, and the galaxy will either bend to us or break beneath us. It was no longer about alliances or peace or compromise. It was about power, and the galaxy was about to find out just how much the Deathworlders had. And there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. The galaxy had been warned. Now it would feel the consequences. The universe held its breath. From the outskirts of the galaxy to the heart of the great empires, rumors of the Deathworlders' shift had spread like wildfire. The galaxy's diplomatic framework, once intricately woven over centuries of cautious alliances, had begun to unravel. Systems that had once relied on the Deathworlders for protection, stability, and negotiation found themselves scrambling, unsure of where they stood in the face of this newly awakened force. Gerrard stood in the nerve center of the Deathworlder warship Vigilance, a massive, obsidian-colored ship that hummed with the quiet power of a species ready to stake its claim. A series of holographic displays floated around him, showing live data streams from every corner of the galaxy. The long-term allies were quiet now. The enemies, those who thought they might test the Deathworlders' newfound ruthlessness, were far more vocal. A fleet of Danskan warships had crossed into Deathworlder-controlled space, their fleets positioned on the edge of a sector Gerrard had claimed for his people. They were defying the obvious, testing the strength of the Deathworlders in a way that could be called foolish or bold, depending on how you viewed it. Gerrard studied the data, unfazed. A response was already being prepared. His advisors were already assembling fleets, ready to meet the challenge, but there was no panic. There was no fear. The Deathworlders were not interested in warnings anymore. They had shown the galaxy their strength. Now they would show what happened when that strength was ignored. I don't think we should act immediately, Lyra, the head of military strategy, said as she entered the room, her voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. We need to understand their movements. If we rush in, we risk losing the advantage. Gerrard's eyes narrowed as he turned to face her. If we wait too long, we risk giving them the confidence to push further. Lyra nodded thoughtfully. True, but I suggest we don't simply destroy their fleet. We make them understand why they shouldn't test us again. Gerrard stared at the map, his thoughts moving rapidly. Lyra was right. A swift, overwhelming strike would send a message, but it might also galvanize others, emboldening them to make similar challenges. No, what he had in mind was far worse than just obliterating their ships. We'll make them suffer, Gerrard said coldly. His voice had an edge to it now, a gleam of something dangerous in his eyes. We'll hit their fleets, take them down piece by piece, but we won't give them an easy death. We'll break them, make them question whether the cost is worth it. And then, when they're broken, we'll give them one last choice. Lyra raised an eyebrow, impressed by the cold calculation in his tone. You want them to beg? No, Gerrard replied. I want them to understand their place in this universe. On the fringes of the Danskin fleet, Grak stood on the bridge of his flagship, Gerrard's roar, his massive form silhouetted against the star-filled void. His broad shoulders were tense, his eyes scanning the data screens. The Danskin forces were formidable, their ships fast and deadly, built for warfare. But they were small in number compared to the Deathworlders. And Grak was beginning to feel the pressure of their approaching response. "They're coming," Shira reported, her voice steady but tinged with concern. She pointed to the star charts, showing the slow-moving approach of Deathworlder ships. "They've mobilized faster than expected. Their fleets are already in motion." "Good," Grak growled, clenching his fists. "Let them come. We will show them the price of disrespect." The communication officer's voice cut through the air, urgent. "Commander, the Deathworlder fleet is not only arriving. They're moving in from multiple directions. It's not a simple front. They're splitting their forces." Grak's lips twisted into a smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. It was a predator's grin, the calm before the storm. "Let them try." Back aboard the Vigilance, Gerrard stood before the vast holographic display, his finger hovering above a control. The Danskin fleet was moving predictably towards the core of Deathworlder space. The Deathworlders had anticipated this response. The response was already in motion. Gerrard's fingers dropped, and the command was given. At once, the Deathworlder fleet split into two. The first wave of ships, the Sentinels, plunged directly toward the Danskin front, creating an immediate battle. The second wave, led by Vigilance itself, maneuvered behind the Danskin fleet, cutting off any retreat. The Deathworlders knew no mercy in battle. They only knew how to overwhelm and destroy. The battle that ensued was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Explosions lit up the void, ships engaged in brutal dogfights. And for every ship the Deathworlders took down, another seemed to be replaced by their relentless tide of force. The Danskin, for all their strength and will to fight, found themselves pressed into retreat with no room to maneuver. But it wasn't the destruction that had Grak's blood boiling. It was the way the Deathworlders fought. Every strike was calculated, but never hasty. They cut down their enemies slowly, deliberately, giving no mercy. It was a terrifying display of cold-blooded precision, not unlike how a hunter toys with its prey before delivering the killing blow. As the last of the Danskin warships were overwhelmed, Grak's flagship, Gerrard's roar, remained in the center, barely holding on. His eyes were wild, his fangs bared in fury. "They're toying with us," Grak muttered. "They're not killing us. They're making us feel every moment of our failure." The communication officer's voice broke the tension. "Commander, we've received a transmission from the Deathworlder flagship." Grak snarled. "What is it?" The officer hesitated before responding. "It's a message, Commander, from Gerrard." The screen flickered to life, revealing Gerrard's calm face. His gaze was unwavering, almost predatory. "You should have never come here, Grak. You thought you could challenge us, but all you've done is prove that you are weak." Gerrard's voice echoed through the bridge. "You will leave here, broken, and remember this moment as the last time you ever thought you could match us." Gerrard's eyes darkened. "And for the record, we don't kill you to win. We make you live with the knowledge that you'll never be strong enough to face us again." The transmission ended. The Danskin fleet was decimated, but Grak's flagship was still intact, hanging on by the thinnest thread of survival. Grak's expression shifted from rage to resignation. He knew, as did every warrior on his ship, that the Deathworlders were no longer an ally or a protector. They were the apex, and those who challenged them would find themselves crushed underfoot. Grak looked around the bridge, and for the first time in his life, he knew what true fear felt like. Back on the Deathworlder capital, Gerrard stood before the council once again, his gaze heavy with the weight of his decisions. The Danskin had been broken. The universe had witnessed it. They had learned. "They will never forget this," Lyris said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You've set the precedent. No one will dare test us again." Gerrard nodded slowly, his mind already moving forward. "The galaxy will never forget the day Deathworlders stopped being nice. And they will know we are not to be challenged." Outside the council room, the stars stretched across the void. The Deathworlders had shown the galaxy their true face. And the universe would either bend to them or break beneath their weight. The beast had roared. Now, the galaxy would tremble in its wake. The Deathworlders had won, and there would be no going back.